I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case. I was staring at the corner of a page when it began to rain. The kind of faint, persistent drizzle that feels more like a memory than weather. The Ashmolean was almost empty that morning, the print room colder than usual. The radiator beneath the sash window had given up years ago. I hadn't come for the art, not really. Not consciously. I'd told myself it was the Turners, watercolors of Devon cloudscapes, precise and patient, but it was silence I was after. Silence and the particular loneliness that only Oxford offers in December. There is a difference, I think, between solitude and silence. One is chosen, the other noticed. A schoolgirl's voice was drifting faintly from the courtyard below, Latin haltingly sung, something liturgical, the shape of it familiar even if the words weren't, a Christmas service rehearsal, no doubt. The voice rose once, cracked slightly on a high E, and disappeared into the stone. I let my eyes drift from the watercolors to the labels beneath them, typed, yellowed, and dated. One had been mislabeled, I was certain, though I couldn't quite say why. Something about the year or the handwriting. Not Turner's, not the curator's either. The museum's register would know, but I wasn't interested enough to ask. That was how it began, not with certainty but with something else. The sense of an error. There are mornings when the world aligns a little too neatly. The cold, the rain, the faint suggestion of something out of place, all of it seeming to lean just slightly toward consequence. I walked home slowly, past Magdalen and the High, where the buskers had packed away their instruments and even the pigeons looked subdued. My coat was damp by the time I reached the flat. 3 days later, the letter arrived. It was Lewis who brought it in, still tucked in his inside pocket as he peeled off his gloves. "Nothing urgent," he said. "No return address. Just typed unsigned." He placed it on my desk with the quiet formality of a man handing over a confession. I read it twice before speaking. "You won't find her name." But I saw her leave. "Look again at the register." The paper was smooth, expensive, the kind used by solicitors or schools with their own crests. The words were centered on the page, as if intended for an epitaph. I remember glancing at the clock on the filing cabinet. 11:23. The radiator for once was working, a steady breath of warmth across the ankles, insufficient but noticed. "Who brought it in?" I asked. "No one saw," said Lewis. "Left at the front desk sometime in the last hour. No envelope?" "None, just folded." The anonymity was practiced, but not hurried. Whoever wrote it knew how to vanish. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the phrase, "Look again at the register." What register? I didn't ask aloud. Instead, I stood, walked to the window and stared at the cars lined up below. It had started to drizzle again. Or perhaps it never stopped. There was a hotel fire once, I forget the name, where the guest register was destroyed, and no one could say whether the girl had been there at all. But this wasn't that. This felt older, more careful. I thought of school registers, museums, college visitors' books, discreet and leather-bound. I thought, oddly, of choir rehearsals in Latin. You won't find her name, she had been removed then. Not missing, but erased. That was the distinction, not the kind that leaves a space behind, but the kind that folds itself closed like a sketchbook, quietly returned to its shelf. The next day, I returned to the Ashmolean. The Turners were gone, replaced by something German and angular. I stood in the same room, now unfamiliar, and watched as a man adjusted the lighting over an etching of a staircase that led nowhere. Sometimes, things leave their trace not in what they were, but in what they interrupt. That was how she began for me, whoever she was. Not with a face or a file, but with a silence in a print room and a typewritten whisper. Look again at the register. And I would, though I did not yet know where. Northmoor College for Women sits behind a veil of green iron gates, its modest facade softened by ivy and age. It is the sort of place where time does not pass so much as settle. In the stone, in the air, in the way tea is poured with a pause before the milk. It was founded, I'm told, by a minor baronet's second daughter, who believed in the intellect of women but not, curiously, their ambition. The college had survived by cultivating silence. Cecilia Hathaway had been, until recently, a fellow in medieval literature, a field already half buried in parchment and ghostlight. I had never met her. But I had heard the name, once I think at a dinner in St. Hilda's, mentioned by a guest who spoke of her work on the melancholic lyric as though it were something sacramental. She had published little. That alone made her interesting. The college claims she left to travel. Sicily, perhaps, or the Dodecanese, places people mention when they wish to imply solitude and sun. But her rooms remain untouched. The porter was not unhelpful, just resistant to clarity. He spoke in slow curls of phrase, as though each word might fracture if landed too heavily. Yes, Miss Hathaway had left. No, she had not said when she might return. Yes, her rooms were still in her name. Yes, her books were there, and her coats. No, no forwarding address, only that she had gone to sea. Gone to sea. A phrase too literary for the man who used it. I asked about visitors during Hilary term. He nodded toward the front hall. The guest register sat beneath a glass dome, beside a vase of brittle hydrangeas and a notice about fire doors. It had the usual mix of unremarkable surnames and scribbled initials, a parent or two, a visiting tutor, someone from Cambridge who left no time of arrival, and once, faintly pressed into the page for early February, a name that had been there and was not. I felt it first, before I saw it, a gap in the grain of the paper, the slight indentation where pressure had once lived. The page had been scraped. People vanish. Names do not usually vanish too. I turned to Lewis, who stood politely bored in the corridor, and said, more to myself than to him, "Someone's cleaned the register." He raised an eyebrow. I didn't elaborate. Miss Hathaway had evidently been visited, and someone had found that inconvenient. I asked if I might see her rooms. The bursar, a pale woman with a jaw that looked inherited rather than chosen, hesitated. She cited decorum, privacy, the college's values. I reminded her of the values we might apply if foul play were suspected. That always sounds faintly ridiculous in Oxford, as though suggesting murder in a cathedral. But it worked. The rooms were on the second floor. A narrow staircase led up through dusky light and the smell of dried paint. Inside, the space was precise. A desk with squared blotting paper, curtains half drawn, a row of books on Anglo-Norman devotion, each one annotated in a script as neat as frost. A cardigan lay over the arm of a chair. There was a glass with water still in it, half evaporated, nothing dramatic. But nothing left. No one goes to sea without packing. I stood in the center of the room, arms folded, listening. It is my habit to listen for the echo of a decision, to find what is not said. There was too much stillness here. Not the aftermath of departure, but of interruption. A note, perhaps. A last letter. I checked the desk drawers. Receipts from Blackwell's. An envelope addressed to the London Review of Books and, curiously, an unfinished crossword. 5 across. Not quite seen, but sensed. 7 letters. I stared at it. I would not answer it. Not yet. Downstairs, I paused again at the register, scraped, altered, corrected into silence. I know how names are erased. It takes care. And intent. Miss Hathaway had gone to sea, yes, but someone had taken the boat away after her. The college had that peculiar hush particular to late afternoons in winter, not quiet exactly, but padded, as if sound itself wore wool. We were shown to the senior common room by a student, with an expression somewhere between reverence and boredom. The room smelt faintly of tobacco leaf and lemon polish, with afternoon light sifting through tall windows like diluted gold. Lewis stood near the fireplace, hands behind his back like a schoolboy rehearsing for inspection. I let him stay that way. Dr. Isla Fairbairn arrived first, a classicist, and the sort who dissects grammar with the precision of a scalpel. Her voice was clipped, each consonant cleanly finished. She wore a brooch in the shape of an owl and gloves she never quite removed. Miss Hathaway, she said, was of another register entirely. Not gregarious, nor I think designed for long company. She read silence as others read newspapers, for headlines. Had she visited her before she left? A pause, then she didn't say goodbye. Not properly. It seemed her style. Her hands betrayed her. She kept adjusting the glove on her left wrist, tugging at the button though it was fastened. Something had been left unsaid, something perhaps intentionally misremembered. Next came Felix Dalrymple, the dean, grey-templed, smiling as if in preemptive apology. He quoted Houseman before we'd asked a question. Something about silence and dust. Cecilia, he said, had the kind of intelligence that folds inward. Not to withhold, but because the outward world was somehow less convincing to her than what she already carried. Did she speak of travel? He poured himself a glass of sherry, held it for a moment and then set it down untouched. She had a fondness for boats, he said, though I suspect not for the sea. Lionel Swithin was last to arrive, apologizing for lateness, though we hadn't asked. He had Hathaway's book in his coat pocket, dog-eared, underlined in 2 colors. His voice was full of deferrals. She taught me how to doubt kindly, he said, as if quoting scripture. They had, he admitted, grown apart. He had been her student, then her friend, then something unclassifiable. Sometimes I wrote her poems, he said, half laughing. She rarely replied. When she did, she corrected the scansion. He looked away as he spoke, toward the bookcase where a bust of George Eliot watched like a silent archivist. Julia Morton, the bursar, joined us in her own time. She looked tired in the way precision makes one tired, like someone who'd alphabetized the unspeakable. She always left the curtains drawn, Julia said it kept the light from interfering with her thinking. There was something in her tone that softened unexpectedly. She spoke of Hathaway not as colleague or tenant, but as something closer to a lost sister. I packed away some of her scarves, she said. They still smelt of geranium. We asked about visitors. Julia shook her head, but it was the porter, old enough to have known 3 provosts and outlived 2, who gave us something different. Yes, he remembered a woman. Late October, he thought. Wide-brimmed hat, plum-colored coat. Asked for Miss Hathaway, he said. Seemed surprised when I told her she'd gone. Did she leave a name? He scratched his cheek with the deliberate slowness of recall. No, but she looked like someone who didn't expect to be forgotten. I returned to the sherry tray before we left. 4 glasses, 1 used. Dalrymple's untouched. Swithin drank only water. Fairbairn declined. Julia hadn't stayed, which meant someone had helped themselves earlier, or else someone had been expected and left before we arrived. The bottle bore no fingerprints. Back outside, the sun was low, casting the buildings in pewter and flame. Lewis said, half to himself, "Odd thing to leave without taking your name." I nodded. Yes, but stranger still when someone else removes it for you. It was raining again, though not with conviction. A half-hearted drizzle, more mood than meteorology. I had walked to the Radcliffe camera without umbrella or intention. Inside, the smell was as I remembered. Parchment, dust, old coats, and older arguments. I wasn't looking for anything. That's how I tend to find things. It was in the southwest stack, wedged between a biography of Newman and something obscure on Elizabethan cryptography. De Profundis, Oscar Wilde's letter to a world he no longer trusted. The spine cracked gently as I opened it, the pages softened by repetition, and then her hand. Delicate, exact, with a sharpness in the tail of each S. A literary scalpel. Cecilia Hathaway had annotated with quiet intensity, not the fevered margin notes of a student, but the calm of someone confident in her reading. One phrase had been underlined twice. A Latin insertion in the margin beside it, "Captivitas non semper est vinculis sed vocibus." Captivity is not always marked by chains, but by voices. I stood there, unmoving, as if the stone might shift around me. Somewhere in that ink was the echo of the voice I'd heard in the Ashmolean courtyard. Latin rising in uncertain thirds, cracking on a high note. A rehearsal. A girl's voice, the same phrase, possibly. Not identical, perhaps, but emotionally consonant. I copied the marginalia into my notebook, closing the book with something near reverence. Not for Wilde, though he deserved it, but for Hathaway's particular silence. Lewis found me 20 minutes later, clutching a folder with the posture of someone who'd carried it through light rain and moral uncertainty. "You're going to want to see this," he said, passing me the sheet. It was the visitor register, Northmoor's, Hilary term. The page in question scanned, and now highlighted, a single line where C. Hathaway had been overwritten in new ink with J. Morton. Neat, but not Hathaway's hand. I asked Lewis how it was found. He said a junior administrator noticed the date column didn't match the formatting of the others. A slight indentation, an ink change. I closed the folder. We went to see Julia Morton after evensong. Her office was dark-panelled and warm, with a clock that ticked with ecclesiastical patience. I laid the scan before her. Her eyes registered it, but her face did not. She said calmly she had corrected a clerical error, a misentry logged under the wrong name. Visitors should be recorded accurately. For security, for insurance. Had Miss Hathaway been expecting a visitor? She paused just long enough for the air to tighten. Then, "Not to my knowledge." But then she rarely expected anyone. She said it kindly, as one might speak of a friend already halfway gone. I watched her reach for a paperweight shaped like a shell. Not decorative, habitual. Her fingers curled around it like something to hold rather than something to display. Outside, we walked slowly. Lewis said, "It's plausible, isn't it?" And that it was just a correction. I didn't answer. The phrase from Wilde returned to me. Incarceration is rarely marked on a calendar, but always in the voice. It had nothing to do with prisons, or rather not the sort with bars. Miss Hathaway had been confined. Somewhere quieter, somewhere sanctioned, and someone was now speaking very carefully on her behalf. The postcard arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked among circulars and council correspondence, its reverse barely dry. A view of Llandwyn, that thin spit of Welsh Island just off the coast of Anglesey, all wind and ruin and sea-blunted chapels. The image looked staged. A lighthouse glared into dusk, though the sky betrayed no sun. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. See, the message read, "The sea is still cold." I think of Emily. It was addressed in looping script to Felix Dalrymple at Northmoor College. No return address, just the echo of someone who still existed enough to post a card, but not enough to place herself. Lewis brought it to me in the quad, interrupting a moment I'd reserved for nothing in particular. He held it carefully like a relic. I stared at the words for a long time before speaking. "Who's Emily?" I asked. He didn't know. But someone did. Dalrymple was in his office. Shelves in gentle disarray, books sleeping sideways. A small radio humming Schubert beneath a window, cracked just enough to let in cold and birdsong. I passed him the postcard. He read it with the stillness of someone rereading a dream. Emily, he said finally, was Cecilia's sister. Drowned herself in the Cherwell 20 years ago. She'd been 21. He said the year as though it might still change. I waited. Cecilia had never spoken of it easily, he continued. Or often. But in recent months she'd been different. Not melancholic precisely. That was her usual weather, but agitated beneath the calm. She kept returning to an old college photograph. I asked what it showed. 3 women, taken in spring on the lawn outside the chapel. He remembered the light, and the shadow across one of the faces. One was Emily, one was Margaret Leighton, missing since 1986. Walked out of her rooms in Exeter College and never returned. The third was Cecilia, or had been. The copy he saw last had her face inked out. Not violently, deliberately. He said she refused to explain. Just called it her correction. There are people who carry the past like a satchel, always within reach. Cecilia, it seemed, carried hers like something sewn into the lining of her coat. You were more than colleagues, I said. Dalrymple didn't blink. He looked past me toward the courtyard. We tried once, he said. A long time ago. I think we mistook silence for intimacy. Had she said where she might go? He shook his head. Just kept mentioning tides, patterns of withdrawal. He thought she was speaking metaphorically, but some metaphors become travel plans. Later in my flat, I placed the postcard on the table beside an unfinished Times crossword and poured myself a cautious measure of Talisker. The sea is still cold. That, at least, was true. I remembered Landwin, a visit years ago, long before the uniform, before Oxford, a place where the sea wrapped the land in a kind of broken promise. The stones spoke there if one knew how to listen. I wrote the phrase down again. The sea is still cold. I think of Emily, and then beneath it, a line that arrived unbidden, not a message of presence, but of permission. Dalrymple had said she wasn't herself. I wasn't sure who she had been instead. One dead, one missing, one erased. I wondered which one Cecilia believed she was, or which one she feared she'd become. The key turned with a reluctance I recognized. There are some doors that remember being closed. Hathaway's rooms had not changed since I last stood in them, and yet they had. The light was the same, northern, grey, impartial, but the air held something new, a deepening stillness, as though the silence had grown roots. I walked slowly, not as an intruder but as something worse, a mourner without a name to grieve. Dust had begun to settle in the corners with the particular arrogance of abandonment. On the desk, a dictionary lay open, as if interrupted mid-thought. Beside it, a box of pins, some tarnished, a single one bent. In the wardrobe, a row of coats, the kind that hang like empty verdicts. Hathaway's life had been kept with severity and care. Nothing excessive. No spilled perfume, no postcards on the mirror, no softening clutter. And yet it was not cold, only chosen. I opened a drawer beneath the desk. Inside, paper clips, an eraser worn to its spine, and a torn library slip, half a name, Radcliffe Cam, and a due date too old to matter. Folded behind it, almost missed, a sheet of thick paper. A poem, typed then marked in pencil. Never published, I'd wager. The ink was uneven, as though the keys had hesitated. It began with Persephone, but not the myth. Rather, the moment she stood in the garden, not knowing the fruit had changed her mouth. A door locked from the inside, a name that changed with each man's desire. Then the final line, typed more firmly than the rest, as if not for revision. You took the register, but I kept the name. I read it 3 times. On the 4th, I folded it gently and slid it into my notebook. Back outside, the city looked impatient with its own dampness. Lewis was waiting by the porter's lodge. A thin envelope had just arrived for me. Internal post, no stamp, no signature. Inside, a photograph. Black and white, slightly curled, the edges feathered. Entire school group, late 1960s. Girls in uniform seated by height unsmiling. Third from the right in the second row, a girl whose eyes were blurred by the soft tremor of time, not by accident, a thumbprint or deliberate smudging. Her name was missing from the list on the reverse. The other girls were accounted for. One was Emily Hathaway, younger than the obituary photo, but clearly her. Another, if I wasn't mistaken, was Margaret Layton. The third girl had no name, but even blurred, I recognized the shape of her. Not Cecilia, not precisely, but someone who might have become her, or someone she had chosen to become instead. I held the photo against the light. A slight crease ran through the girl's shoulder, as though someone had folded the truth once and then left it that way. Lewis said something I didn't catch. I nodded anyway. Back in my office, I placed the photo beside the poem, one erased, one renamed. The torn library slip fluttered slightly in the draft. People leave, but only rarely do they vanish, and when they do, it is almost never for the first time. This wasn't about departure. It was about refusal. Refusal to be fixed in place. Refusal to be written down by anyone but oneself. And in the margin of the poem, in faded pencil, a note, barely there. She was never on the register, only in the room. I lit a cigarette I wouldn't finish and watched the ash fall. Some lives are drawn in ink, others erase themselves by design. It began with something ordinary, a reunion list, folded discreetly into the back pages of a college file, like a memory no one wanted but couldn't quite discard. Lewis had found it in the archives, chasing the echo of a different question. I wasn't looking for omissions, only what they usually mean. The list was dated 2021, 40 years since matriculation. Typed in the meticulous font favoured by Oxford. Secretaries all caps, evenly spaced, just this side of impersonal. I scanned the names once, then again. Cecilia Hathaway was not there, nor was Emily. That in itself meant nothing. Absences multiply easily with time, but what drew the breath in my throat and held it was a name circled faintly in biro. Julianne Mortimer. Not Julia Morton, and never, not once, mentioned in any of the college's pristine records. The circle had been made by someone uncertain, the kind of hesitant ink that looks over its own shoulder. I asked Lewis to check civil registration. He returned 2 hours later, the rain dampening his collar, the ghost of suspicion now fact. No records of Cecilia Hathaway before 1972. Nothing. Not birth, not school, not parentage. She began fully formed, like Athena from the skull, in Oxford's graduate registers that year. But Julianne Mortimer, born 1947, applied for an MA in English at Oxford in 1969, accepted, then vanished. No thesis, no graduation, no mention in college minutes. The gap was shaped like a disappearance, and then a name reappeared. 3 years. Later attached to a woman who quoted Anglo-Saxon verse and never missed chapel. Cecilia Hathaway. I stood for a long time at the window of my office, watching a crow land on the Radcliffe's dome like a punctuation mark. The simplest theory, and the one I believed, was this. After Emily's death, Julianne Mortimer became someone else. The girl in the 1960s photograph, the erased name, the voice rehearsing Latin in a courtyard. But if Hathaway had once buried a name to escape scandal, why disinter it now? More urgently, who else knew? I asked Lewis whether Julia Morton might be a coincidence. He didn't answer, which in him is an answer. It seemed unlikely 2 women with nearly identical names could orbit the same life without gravity taking notice. I thought of Morton's tenderness when speaking of Hathaway, the quiet possessiveness, like someone curating more than just memory. I thought of the visitor's register, corrected by a hand pretending not to be personal. And then I thought of the postcard from Wales. I think of Emily. People don't sign the past, they initial it. The crow outside ruffled its feathers once and vanished behind the dome. Later that evening I pulled out the poem again, the one found in the drawer beneath the torn slip. You took the register, but I kept the name. It no longer sounded like defiance, it sounded like warning. There are identities we choose, and those chosen in the moment, just after loss. One carries the shadow of what we were, the other, what we hope not to become. Julianne Mortimer had vanished in 1969. Cecilia Hathaway had emerged in 1972. Someone knew the space between, and someone wanted her to become no one again. I've always, liked the elegance of a good crossword, not for the satisfaction of solving, but for the way a single word can fold time. Clues are rarely what they seem. They masquerade as riddles, but they're confessions in disguise. The crossword from Hathaway's room had waited quietly in my desk drawer, clipped weeks ago and nearly forgotten beneath the sediment of forms and maps and paper cups gone soft at the rim. A cross, where secrets echo without return. 5. I had circled the clue once, absent-mindedly. That morning I stared at it again, more intently. Vault, a word that does too much. A ceiling, a tomb, a sprint, a verb to keep. That was the kind of answer Hathaway liked, one with resonance. The college chapel, North Moors, stands apart from the main quad, squat and worn and mostly unloved. Few students used it now. The crypt beneath was even less visited, save for the occasional tour group or earnest theology student. I walked there late before dusk, when the last light barely clung to the stone. The porter let me in with a reluctant shrug and handed over a ring of keys with all the ceremony of a man surrendering history. The air below was cold and self-contained. Old chapels breathe differently, not with oxygen, but with time. I moved slowly, letting my shoes tap against the flagged floor. Near the east wall, beneath a sunken arch, a patch of stone looked too clean. There was no lock, only a panel not properly seated, its edge worn smooth, behind it a book, cloth-bound, unlabeled, its spine faded to near oblivion. I opened it gently. Inside were letters, dozens, tucked chronologically, from 1975 to 1980, written in the kind of looping script that tries not to be vulnerable and fails. They began formally, then shifted. By the second envelope, Dear C had become Darling, then my firebrand, then no salutation at all. Just words burning straight through the page. They were furious, electric, unruly, and then by the third year, cautious. The letters spoke in code. References to books, to weather, to chapel bells and the room with the red glass. One note referenced a name I carry like a coat you never asked for me to wear. Another, the college will never forgive what it does not understand. And then, the final entry, no date, just a page torn roughly from a different notebook. I took your name once. Now I give it back. But I still remember. And so will they. The handwriting had changed slightly, firmer, resigned but not regretful. The implications turned slowly in me, like a key not yet fully turned. Who was C? Was it Hathaway? Or the writer of the letters? The initials could belong to anyone. Cecilia, Clarissa, Clara, even Catherine. But I remembered the poem. You took the register. But I kept the name. I thought again of Julia Morton, of the tenderness when she spoke of Hathaway, the possessive pauses, the slight emphasis on we in sentences where it didn't quite belong. Was she the C who had written these? Or the C to whom they were written? Had Hathaway stolen her name or returned it? The letters didn't say. They only hummed with the energy of something once bright and now contained. I replaced them as I'd found them. The panel slid back without resistance. Back above ground, the chapel was empty. I stood in the center aisle and listened. No echo. Only the sound of a place too tired to remember out loud. In the crossword, vault had seemed clever. Down here, it felt more like confession. And somewhere between the names they shared and the ones they erased, the truth had lived for a while, unspeakable, but not forgotten. The chapel was half empty for evensong. The rain had begun again, fine, piercing, and without rhythm, and most of the college had retreated indoors to their dinners or their essays or their rituals of quiet collapse. I sat 3 pews from the back, out of habit more than belief, coat damp across the shoulders, the crossword from earlier still folded in my breast pocket like a private dare. The service began with little ceremony. No procession, no flourish, just the rustle of pages, the soft cough of someone finding the wrong psalm, and then silence, of the deepest kind. And into that silence, A voice. Solo. Soprano. Clear, mournful. Carried on something more than melody. Phrased with such aching precision, it struck the breath from my chest. Not just the pitch. The intelligence of it, the way each Latin syllable hung for a moment before falling, as if the voice knew the weight of the words, and had lived inside them for years. I closed my eyes. Not the same voice I'd heard faintly from the Ashmolean courtyard all those weeks ago, but close enough to draw blood from memory. Not a student, a teacher. The solo ended, and with it the illusion. The final chord faded into the stone like a promise left too late. After the service, I waited. The choir filtered out in clumps, robes tucked under arms, heads bowed against the damp. I let most pass. Then I saw her, Dr. Isla Fairbairn, moving with the clipped grace of someone who dislikes being observed, but knows she is. She walked as if rehearsing her own alibi. I fell into step beside her before she reached the cloister. "Lovely service," I said. "Indeed," she replied, not pausing. "And the soloist, unusual phrasing." "Quite affecting." She stopped then, just for a second. "The girls are taught to phrase with clarity. The rest is interpretation. There was no girl." I said nothing. She adjusted her scarf. "Unnecessarily, you sang it," I said. She turned her head slightly, then continued walking. "That's not a question. You studied choral theory at St. Andrews. Your paper on modal transition in women's plainchant still circulates. Unsighted, of course." She didn't smile. But she didn't walk away either. "Why now?" I asked. "Why sing it now?" No answer. We stopped beneath the colonnade. The wind slipped around us in small, educated sighs. "You knew about Hathaway." Her lips parted. "You knew about Mortimer." Still silence. "You knew about the letters." A pause. "Then I knew enough to help her disappear, or enough to know someone wouldn't let her." She looked away, past the darkening windows, toward the chapel where her voice had only just been extinguished. Cecilia planned it, didn't she? The name, the postcard, the myth, a quiet ending. One last self-erasure. But someone feared the scandal would outlive her, and tried to erase her a little more. Fairbairn's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. "She didn't deserve that," I said. "She didn't want to be remembered." She said, "But you do, stillness." I quoted her lecture from last term, one she thought no one remembered. "Not truth from the well," I said. "You called it truth from the vault." A deliberate misquote. One only a classicist could slip through. Her eyes flickered. "You were clever," I said, "but not quiet enough." She inhaled, then exhaled as though finishing something that had been waiting a long time. "There are truths that should remain buried." She said, "No, there are only truths that no longer serve us, and we bury them like debts." She turned then, and this time I let her leave. Some confessions are made not in words, but in voices, and in that chapel during evensong, I heard a truth clearer than any testimony. The dead don't always write their ending. Sometimes others do it for them. Lewis found the records mid-morning, bringing them in with the diffidence of someone carrying the lidless past. He laid the file gently on my desk, beside the folded crossword and the postcard from Wales, now curling at the edges like something sea-touched. He said nothing but waited, standing, not sitting. That's how I knew it mattered. 3 names from a girls' boarding school in Dorset. Class of 1964, Julianne Mortimer. Emily Mortimer. Isla Fairbairn listed under her maiden name, Isla Denholm. And there they were, all 3 in the photograph I had stared at for nights without shape. The blurred girl, the missing name, the space where truth had curled up and waited for someone to ask again. Not strangers, then. Not even friends, more than that. I stared at the names. Beneath them, attendance notes, marks for Latin, 1 fine for climbing out after lights out, 3 lives briefly aligned by corridors, shoes polished by duty, and a world that taught girls how to vanish long before it taught them how to speak. The letters had not lied. only whispered too softly to be heard until now. They were from Cecilia to Isla, from Julianne to Isla, from someone desperate to love and someone less certain how to be loved in return. I called Fairbairn in. She arrived quickly, but with no attempt at disguise. Dressed as always in clean lines and careful wool, a brooch in the shape of a lyre, her face unreadable, not stony but composed, like someone whose grief had long ago been alphabetized. I slid the photograph across the desk. She glanced at it. No flicker. No reach. Your name was Denholm, I said. She didn't reply. You were in love with her, still nothing. The letters, I continued, weren't just about longing. They were about identity. Who Julianne wanted to be, who she had to become. She turned away then slightly. Just the angle of her shoulders. It was enough, I said it carefully. Not accusation, just clarity. She changed her name after Emily died. Became Cecilia. Became someone new. You watched her do it. You helped her, maybe. And then you lost her. I waited. You thought she would come back. But she didn't. You kept the chapel. The voice. The books. She kept the sea. And when the postcard arrived and when you realized she had walked into the sea and never meant to return, you erased her name. Not to hide a crime, but to sever the cord, to bury her again. You took her name from the visitor's register. Not because you didn't want her found, but because you couldn't bear what she had done without you. Fairbairn exhaled. A sound like a note held too long. Her voice was very quiet. She left before I could forgive her, then silence again. You couldn't save her. I said, no, and so you preserved her in the cruelest way. I saw it all then. Not in gestures, not in facts, but in the aching architecture of what had been unsaid. Hathaway, Mortimer, had walked into the sea. Quietly, deliberately. The final disappearance. No scandal, no mess, no letters left on the desk. Only the postcard. And her name left behind for one final time. And Fairbairn, loyal, wounded, unable to follow, had taken that name and undone it. Not out of malice, but out of preservation. Out of grief, a cruel kindness. I asked one last thing. Did you see her that day? A pause. She was wearing Emily's coat, and then she left. I let her go. I watched Fairbairn leave the station with the same gait as always. Precise, unhurried, unreadable. Didn't call after her. Some truths do not want to be prosecuted. They want only to be remembered, and some names do not want to be. Found they only want to rest where water does not speak. The file remained, open on my desk long after I had ceased looking at it. A single page fluttered when the radiator coughed on, the wind having bullied its way in through the sash window, though I'd not invited it. A photograph, a torn library slip, a postcard from Landwin. Nothing that proved a crime. Nothing that answered anything with the sharpness bureaucracy prefers. Only fragments arranged like offerings around an absence. The case as it stood was unresolved. No body, no charges, no inquest. Just a woman who had been several women. A life told through omissions. A death folded quietly into the rhythm of tide and dusk. Lewis had gone for the day, but not before asking, should we pursue charges? For Morton, for Fairbairn, falsifying records, misleading police, obstruction. He meant it gently, but it hung like steam. I had stared at the window then. Not at anything. Just through. No, I said. He looked at me. She took her own name, I said. They just didn't like where she left it. He nodded. Left without another word. He was learning when not to ask more. Later, long after the halls had emptied and the last tram bell echoed off the high street, I walked the short path back to Northmoor. The night was clear, the kind of dark Oxford does best, and velveted, watchful, ancient. I had the key. I hadn't asked. The college library had the same smell it always did. Paper, wax polish. Something vaguely ecclesiastical, as though knowledge itself required reverence. I went to the south stack fourth shelf, the wild section. De Profundis sat waiting, soft-spined, slightly loosened at the edges. I slid a note inside. Not official, not signed. Just a few lines, handwritten, folded once. Julianne or Cecilia or Persephone, I remembered you, no flourish, no farewell. I left it between the pages she had annotated all those years ago, near the line she'd underlined twice, the one about suffering turned inward, turned voice. There are no plaques for lives unclaimed, no ceremony for those who change their names just to continue breathing, but there are pages, and someone someday might turn to that passage, feel the note slide loose and read it as if by accident. That would be enough. Back at home, I poured a single measure of whiskey. Not celebration, just punctuation. I sat, coat still on, and placed the record on the turntable. The choral disc, Northmore's Evensong 2021. A recording made for the archive, not the world. The solo came near the end. It rose quietly, not demanding attention. Just arriving. The voice was unchanged, measured, mournful, resolute. It did not ask for forgiveness. Only space, only remembrance. It filled the room the way smoke fills a chapel, curling into corners, lingering in beams. I listened to the whole piece through. Then again, the file on my desk stayed open. I would close it in the morning. Not now. Now was for her. Not the her they remembered. Not the her the college erased, or the one the sea folded into its blue hush, but the woman who stood between names, between bodies, between lives, and wrote poems about doors that locked from the inside. She had vanished carefully, like breath drawn back before speech, and all I had left was this, a voice, still singing, through stone, through silence, through the vault where secrets echo without return. The snow arrived without announcement. Oxford, usually hesitant in its seasons, gave itself fully to the cold that week, cloaking spires and paving stones with the kind of hush usually reserved for prayer. Footsteps became whispers. Bells, distant and few, hung longer in the air. Like old truths reluctant to vanish, news came slowly, as it tends to in places that still rely on porters and rumour. Julia Morton had stepped down from her role at Northmore. Mutual agreement, the phrase used when both parties prefer to nod rather than explain. Her office was cleared in silence. Her papers boxed and gone by the time anyone thought to ask where she'd gone. Isla Fairbairn had taken a sabbatical. No reason offered. She'd left a single lecture slide for her successor, a quotation from Euripides, oddly translated, and Felix Dalrymple, whose tenure had once seemed as fixed as the chapel's stonework, submitted early retirement with a note that began, "I find myself more drawn to solitude than precedent." No statement was made about Hathaway. No notice posted. No memorial held. Only the register was changed. Hilary Term, once marred with names corrected, crossed, inserted, erased, Mundell was now blank. No guests, no Hathaway. It was as if she had never been there at all. I went back, one evening, not from duty. Something less. Or perhaps more. The porter nodded me in without fuss. The fire in the entrance hall had dimmed to coals, and the vase of hydrangeas had been replaced with something even more brittle. The visitor's log sat beneath its glass dome. I lifted it gently. The page for Hilary Term was crisp, white untouched, and yet at the bottom faintly, not ink, but graphite. As though written in hesitation or apology, a single line had appeared since my last visit. Julianne wants nothing more. No flourish. No surname, just the weight of a life spoken softly. I closed the book slowly, as if afraid to unmake it. Names, when written in pencil, carry a different truth. They can be erased, but not forgotten. Outside, Oxford had fallen under its second hour of snow. The city gleamed, not white exactly, but grey-blue, the colour of forgotten letters and candle smoke. I stood on the steps for a moment. Coat open, the cold finding its way in, somewhere down the lane. A bell rang, not loud. Not near a college hour struck a note it had struck for centuries, I thought then, not of endings, but of names, and how long they echo once spoken. even if spoken wrong, even if spoken only once. Some names become myth, others ash, but a few are simply returned to silence, their last syllables trailing like breath behind a door gently closed. I walked home without speaking, and I did not look back.